Today we're taking a closer look at one of the most enduring images in post-war art, Andy Warhol's Marilyn. More than 6 decades after the Niagara publicity still first entered his studio, the 1967 portfolio remains the cornerstone of Warhol's portrait canon and one of the most actively traded bodies of work in the global print market. It sits at the intersection of celebrity, reproduction, and myth-making, the themes that defined Warhol's career, while continuing to command extraordinary commercial and cultural weight. To unpack why Marilyn still dominates both the market and the imagination, I'm joined by Louisa Earl and Jess Bromovsky, two of our senior specialists who have worked closely with these prints across auctions, private sales, and major collections for many years. Jess and Louisa, thank you so much for being here.
Great to be here, Charlotte. Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Jess, I'm going to start with you. Where does the Marilyn portfolio sit within Warhol's portrait canon? Is the origin point of the celebrity as an icon formula that he's so well known for the basis of it, or is it a culmination of ideas he'd already been working through in the early 60s?
I think it's definitely one of his most famous portraits. The Marilyn Monroe series that we see a lot of is just instantly recognizable. You know, it's the one that people come back to again and again. And every time you see that image, you think, yeah, I know that one. I think that rather than it being the origin story, it's more of sort of the perfect storm of a lot of things Warhol was doing at the time and a lot of things that were happening in mass media. Marilyn was the icon of the 50s. You know, that was the moment that she became most famous. And the image that we see is taken actually from a film still called Niagara, which was done in the 50s. And it was the moment where she became most famous. And he repurposed that image, an image that was already recognizable, and then made it his own, and in a very Warhol way made it a celebrity icon.
So was the still of her in that movie famous before Warhol made it? Because I would arguably say this is probably the most, Warhol's image of Marilyn is the most famous image of Marilyn in the world.
Yeah, I would say, well, at the time it was famous in that way of Hollywood. You know, it was the still from the film, but definitely not as famous as it is today. But the film was all about, you know, it was a moment for Marilyn Monroe where I think she was actually plotting to kill her husband at Niagara Falls. And it was a still from that film. And it was used on all the billboards and things. And then he took it and I mean, he added his famous colour, his flat still to it, everything that made it Warhol, and almost piggybacked and made it something even more iconic.
Yeah, he added that Warhol treatment to her image. And I think the key thing is that her face was already so recognizable. And that's what really drew him to her, because he had this obsession with fame. You know, he had this obsession with celebrity. And choosing an iconic photograph of an iconic woman who had just been all over the media for the previous decade, you know, that really exemplifies what he was attracted to as an artist in terms of his source material. And just going back to what you said earlier, Charlotte, about the origin story, you know, I mean, Warhol had already been working in commercial illustration for the previous decade as he slowly started to morph into an independent fine artist. I think what's important, though, about the Marilyn series is that it's the first set of works he did as a set of 10 prints, 10 colorways, and that really set the tone for the rest of his career, especially in terms of the printmaking on paper. You know, works on canvas, those are all singular, what we call original works, but a lot of the prints he did, a lot of the big series he did, you know, that Marilyn set of 10 really is the starting point for him that he then carries forwards to the rest of his career. And I think that's something that will always hold true. It's always going to hold that gravitas.
Yeah. And she had just died.
Yeah.
So she had died a few years before, so it wasn't like he was repurposing something while she was alive. There was a huge amount of mass media at the time because she had just died as well. And he was, I mean, in a way, it was quite a dark moment. He was taking that image and using it at a moment where everyone knew that there was a lot of publicity around her anyway.
So in a way, she was a real vehicle for his portrait series in many ways. I mean, she was quite easy, wasn't she? She was quite an easy option for that first iconic image. She was, as you say, incredibly famous, probably one of the most famous faces in the world at that time. She had just died, and we could go on to talk about death and disaster and tragedy. She was also hugely loved, the sort of saint quality of dying young. was highly iconic. Do you think we are still, when we see Marilyn today, do you think it has a similar effect that it had back then when it was first produced? Or has it become more and more iconic over the decades?
I mean, I think it's become an entire idea in itself and an image in itself. The further away we get from when Marilyn was alive as an actress working in the 50s, the further away we get from who she was as an individual. But that's what Warhol was really doing with his entire artistic output. He was turning things from real life into this repeated imagery, and in doing so, changing the meaning of it. Where's the value? Where's the life in these repeated faces, and kind of separating that idea of identity, fame, seriality to a point where you go, well, are they famous just because we see their image a lot? Who is the person underneath? Where is the real value?
Yeah. I think what we talk about a lot as well is there's no background to these portraits.
Mm,
It is just the head. It's almost like iconography back in the day. It's an idolization of someone without giving
mhm,
any
I
context.
think that's a really interesting point, because a lot of artists, when they create portraits of famous people, are trying to give you a sense of who they are, whereas that's almost stripped back with
Yeah.
Warhol's portraits, isn't it? So why is Liz, Jackie, Elvis, why are they not as loved as the Marilyn? Why not Liz, for instance? Almost as iconic, hugely popular.
mhm.
Why not Liz?
I mean, I was thinking about this before. I think a lot of it is to do with the tragedy that came around Marilyn. She's a mystery. There's mystique to her. She died at
36,
36.
yeah.
Love that. She died at 36. And so you never got the full lifespan of her, all the different things that happened. She was this amazing person people idolized, and then she died. Whereas, although that it's a very similar story with Liz and celebrity and, Hollywood icon, there's not the same mystery. With Elvis, it's a bit different because Warhol with Marilyn did a full series of 10 works, and that image was reproduced, and he did originals, he did the full suite. Whereas with Elvis, there's not 10 portraits of Elvis and screen prints produced in 250.
There's almost this kind of Nostradamus concept as well with that, with these sets and with this imagery of where we are now in the world. I mean, we've had conversations before about kind of what Warhol would think of Instagram, but for me, and what he'd do with it, and his famous quote about 15 seconds of fame. But it is odd, isn't it? It is odd that there was this sort of almost premonition back in the 1960s of this repeated, almost subliminal advertising of personal brand. Personal brand. I suppose in many ways it's the origin of personal brand, what he did with the Marilyn portrait.
Yeah. It's become so relevant in today's world, that idea of personal brand, and it was happening then, but it must have been so much harder then. Now it's what everyone's trying to do with Instagram, with
Do you
everything.
think that's one of the reasons why these portraits are still so popular with collectors now, is that they resonate with something that has almost become commonplace, but was very unique back in the 60s?
I think taking things in their context is always important. I mean, if you think about when Warhol was working in the 60s, they were in the middle of the Cold War. People were still relying on radio and newspaper for their information. And all of a sudden, you have these incredibly vibrant, colorful portraits flooding not necessarily the media, but flooding the world, New York, getting people's attention in a way that had never been done before. And it goes hand in hand with that advancement in advertising that we saw at the time, where all of a sudden advertising was this huge booming industry. It hadn't really existed in that sense before. An entire kind of revolution in how especially the West and the US was starting to function in that post-war era.
Let's talk a little bit about the market. And I will come back to scarcity and emotional resonance we've already touched on. In 2022, something quite phenomenal happened. Shot Sage Blue Marilyn went through auction. There was a turning point in the print market at that time. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so the work came up at auction at Christie's. in 2022, and it sold for $195 million. And it became the most expensive 20th century work at the time. And I think the most expensive work ever sold by an American artist at the time.
Mhm.
And as always, it was in the news. It was a really big thing. It was in the evening sale. Really exciting.
And a work on canvas, just for
And a
clarity,
work
rather
on
than
canvas.
a screen printed
Yeah.
edition.
And I mean, I think we see this time and time again when something big happens in the market with an artist, with a subject like Marilyn, the whole market lifts. You know, it might not stay lifted, but there's a moment of sort of buzz and excitement that means that all the prices come up a bit and people just start looking for those works again. It kind of comes back into the public psyche a bit.
I think there was also a you know, we talk about Warhol as being this artist who's holding value and continues to grow in value. I think what's important to remember is that over the past 10, 15 years, the editions category has really transformed and started to present itself and compete in the market in a way that it never did historically. So there's quite a big transition where in 2010 Marilyn's were selling for tens, £20,000, dollars. You know, now you're adding a zero to that number 10, 15 years later. And I think there is an important point where we look at where people were collecting original works, now are outpriced on original works, started to collect editions, and there has been a transformation there. With that, the accessibility of the editions market has also played a factor because new collectors come into collecting in that sense frequently, and buying a recognizable artist like Andy Warhol, a recognizable image like Marilyn, gives you that security as a new collector that you're making a good choice and a good decision. And with that, we've seen this huge growth in the editions market in general. And I think that there is a parallel there in terms of how these images have become so popular and how they've increased in value.
It's interesting because we talk a lot in other markets about these kind of market moments, whether that be an original that goes through auction and how it picks up momentum for the print market. Are there other examples of that within Warhol's portfolio where there's been a major original and how it's picked up and its series alongside it?
There was definitely a moment where all the Death and Disaster series came through as originals, which are quite complicated subjects. And again, it still gets people talking about the electric chair. Works that sometimes are much lower in value because the subjects are a bit more contentious. And when they come up for auction, it just solidifies a moment of like pricing and desirability and sort of understanding around the works that can then really buoy the market again.
And it's interesting, Louisa, about what you were saying in terms of the value of these works 20 years ago. Has there been a much steeper rise in value for Marilyn's portraits than there have been for other works, or has the whole market? Because I think it's important, as you say, and we don't necessarily talk about this very much. We talk about an artist market developing in a kind of vacuum, but actually the entire prints market is developing, and the energy that's going towards that is bringing prices to the forefront. Has Marilyn had the steepest value increase?
But if you compare Marilyn to other portraits that he did, kind of, you know, let's look at similar time. Mao, for instance, 1973. You know, Mao prints now do not make the same prices that Marilyn prints do, though. They're in separate categories. You can look at his later career. We can look at the Queens, 1985. Again, the queens have grown, especially Queen Elizabeth has significantly grown in value. But again, it's not comparing to some of the prices that the Marilyns make for the most popular colorways.
Exactly. And I think what's really interesting with Warhol's market is there's two sides of it. There's like, I would say Warhol's market compared to lots of other artists' market is actually incredibly steady. You know, it's incrementally gone up year on year, but it's an incredibly mature market now. You know, it's been around since the 60s, 70s, and it's steady and people know what the prices are, and there are sudden bursts, especially when the stock markets go up and things like that. There are moments where the prices rise, but it's pretty steady. What we've seen, especially last year and this year, is like sets like the Endangered Species series suddenly had a boom, and everyone wanted that set, and there's a sort of real enthusiasm around it. but at the same time, the Marilyns have always been there.
Mm.
You know, others come up and down. The Mals, slightly trickier subject, they come up and down a bit, but the Marilyns just consistent.
Mm.
Consistent.
And that's extraordinary when you consider the actual length of
Yeah.
this market, you know, the time of this market compared to some of the newer markets, which where you have those market moments, they're called volatility. When actually, if you just elongate that trend,
Mm.
it's a much more established
Definitely.
marketplace that we're looking at. I want to talk a little bit about scarcity, because you've mentioned things. We've mentioned other portraits. We've mentioned other series in terms of when we see things coming to market. How scarce are Marilyn prints in the market currently?
Depends on the condition. Depends on the scarcity.
Tell you what, answer me first. How scarce are good conditioned Marilyn prints?
They're hard to come by. I think people know the value that they hold, and there's a lot of kind of awareness of the fact that I own this great print. It's a picture of Marilyn, and I love it, and I want to keep it. And because of that, you don't. It's quite difficult to see Marilyns moving around a lot. I mean, we do see
Yeah.
them in the year, but if you think 10 colorways, 250 prints each.
Mm.
It's quite a number of prints. We don't see that many prints moving around all the time.
Yeah, people hold them.
And
It's true.
Jess, I mean, with condition, it varies
Yeah.
so much.
And I think that's with the Marilyn works, it's so important. If
Mm.
there's that many works, even if they're not traded often, everyone wants one in good condition, of course. Like that becomes integral to the work. And there's a lot of things that were going on in the late 90s around rescreening, around condition issues, because the value, like you said before, the value wasn't there to begin with. And I know we say this a lot, but condition can vary hugely. You put it above a radiator, you put it in front of a massive window that has a huge amount of lights. Like each work, depending on where it's at, will vary. And that comes into its price.
I think perception on condition has changed as well. You know, I think historically, maybe people, again, it comes down to value, but let's say you bought a Marilyn early on, you thought, great, I have a Marilyn on my wall, and you put it in a cheap frame and you don't really think about it for 20 years. And then you go, oh, actually, this is worth a lot of value. And you deframe it and you go, oh, right, okay, maybe I should have looked after it a bit better. But I think, you know, it does take time for the value to increase. It's not something that just happens overnight. And the perception of condition issues has changed as well. There is a period of time where, like Jess said, rescreening was really popular. And now that's something that we consider to be too large an intervention on an artwork. So that's also changed.
You quite often will say if something looks too immaculate. When we're talking of an artwork of that age, you know, when we see a work come through and, you know, the vendor or the owner says it's an immaculate condition, you know, how immaculate can a Marilyn print be when
That's
it was
a red
produced?
flag.
Yeah, a red flag.
I think it's a good question. I think it all comes with kind of reflection on what you've seen. You know, we see lots of various things. There are multiple condition issues that can go wrong with a Marilyn. I think also the thing is that we've said, you know, it's 60 years old, this edition. It was created at the very early start of Warhol's career in the factory, where he was experimenting with inks and paper and didn't necessarily use the best materials. So a Marilyn isn't going to survive in the same way that a Queen would, that was made 20 years later with much more robust paper, different ink components. And that comes through into what we see today.
Yeah, and I think that thing of it's almost too good to be true, it's more just that you should be looking out for condition issues, absolutely, but these works will have condition issues.
Yeah.
So if I'm presenting you something that has absolutely none, there's probably a reason why, and it's probably because someone's intervened at some point to make it look absolutely brilliant.
So how much intervention should one take with their Marilyn print?
I mean, as little as possible, ideally, right? You want to be, you want an object that is as close to the artist's original hand as possible. With paper, it's difficult.
Yeah,
Paper
and I would
is
say
an
it's
organic
more
material.
about prevention. Like that's what we say a lot. Like, be mindful of your framing, make sure it's in a good location, make sure you have UV glass on it,
Mm.
prevent things from happening before they do, rather than having to take serious action afterwards.
That being said, I mean, so many paper conservators do incredible work these
Yeah.
days. If you do have a Marilyn that has a little tear at the edge, it can so neatly be fixed on the reverse that you would never know on the front.
Mm.
And I think that is also something that's developed over time, these incredible scientific techniques to preserve artworks. And it's very different to what was on offer from conservators in the 80s and 90s as to what you can get now. And that's also something that collectors need to keep in mind and also be aware of when they're looking at works that are this old.
Yeah, because works can now be flattened, water damage can be restored, and again, it's just making sure they don't deteriorate further more than anything else.
Exactly, yeah.
Right, I'm going to go into the colourways now. So you guys are going to be tested on your mastermind subject quite deeply.
Do we know the numbers off by heart?
Like games.
Most people assume we're talking about a 250 editions size, which means that actually, as you said, it's a lot of prints to be moving around. What colourways present the biggest problems in terms of that condition subject? Are there ones that, the brighter ones that tend to fade more harshly?
It's an interesting question.
hard, yeah.
I mean, I think it depends on the quality of the ink. I think sometimes metallic inks are tricky. And there is, I can't remember what number it is, a version with slightly more metallic-y background.
You've already failed. The black one, or the one
Oh, not
with
the
the
black
silvery
one,
one.
the silvery ones.
Yeah, I know. I also think that with the Marilyns, they're printed to the edges, right? They're all block colours, they're printed to the edges. And that always causes more condition issues because the edges of the frames, they always get scuffing around those areas and things like that too. I think that all the colours are so bright, they all have similar condition issues. But one, I suppose, is the black with the scuff marks, because scuff marks just show up so quickly
On darker colours.
Yeah.
dark background.
Yeah.
And the plasticky inks that you see in some sections of the Marilyns, they can crack, whereas the more powdery inks
That's
have
true.
a bit more movement in them. It doesn't necessarily depend on colorway, it rather depends on which ink where.
I thought it was quite interesting that 3 particular colourways account for almost over half of the realised value of Marilyn prints that have gone through auction in the last 15 years. And that's 23, 31 and 24. First of all, can you name me those colourways?
Sure.
Pink?
31 is the pink,
Yeah.
23 is the teal, and 24 is the black.
Yeah.
Okay, so pink, teal and black.
We like that.
Why?
Yeah.
Why? Is it just coincidence that those ones have come to market? And we know that once one pink goes through, people think, oh, well, I might put my pink through. So there is, we're sort of, it's a bit of a
like a cyclical.
yeah, so like, we sort of create our destiny for these particular colorways every time something goes through auction. But or are there other reasons? Why do these dominate the value so much?
They are the most valuable. I mean, I think a lot of it comes down to personal taste. It's also some of the boldest ones, like the black is very different from any of the other colorways. The pink is incredibly pink. I mean, the teal is your favorite, Louisa.
It is my favorite. I love the
Why
teal.
is it your favorite?
I mean, to be honest, my very simple response is that they're pretty combinations. I mean, it sounds really basic in a way, but they are complementary colors. They're very simple combinations, and they're nice to look at. And some of the other Marilyn combinations are a bit more jarring to the eye. And I do think that then plays out in the prices they achieve.
I think that really is the case, isn't it? So often if you ask a collector why they're going for that one, it's personal preference.
Yeah. I mean, it's also, to a certain degree, it's actually colour theory, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's being very clever.
Yeah, the complementary colours, exactly. Yeah.
And are they, you say they're the most valuable colourways. Is that because they've had more chances to prove themselves on the market?
Well, I'm not sure that is, because the black one really doesn't come up often at all. There are some, like I would say the one we see most frequently or a lot is the Marilyn 29, which again is another kind of blue colorway. But they're traded maybe more often, but they're slightly less valuable.
But it's that perfect balance, isn't it?
Yeah.
By being traded enough to prove yourself, but not traded too much to
Yeah.
be done. I mean, this is the print market in a nutshell, really. Are there any like sleepers in the series? Ones that perhaps you either think are undervalued or just we rarely see the sleeper at either end of the spectrum.
There is one colorway, I can't remember the number, but it's got a very kind of shimmery, taupey, metallic background. And that one I hardly ever see.
Mm.
Yeah. And I don't know why. I don't know where they are.
Isn't that funny?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what about one that you think is undervalued? Perhaps, in terms of its color theory.
I don't know. I'm not sure if any of them are undervalued because they come up so little that actually when they do come up, there is always demand.
Mm.
Um,
There's always one that surprises me in terms of the results it makes,
mm,
which is the green one that's like the green, the red, and the yellow. Because to me, those colors are quite abrupt. It's very bright. It's a very catching object. But personally, for me, I'm always like, wow,
yeah.
it's so popular,
Mm.
and in a way where I wouldn't expect it. Whereas when you look at the teal, that's a very gentle colorway. You expect people to like it.
Mm.
And you know something quite interesting? I think that because they don't come up that often, people aren't always that picky about the colour. They're looking for the Marilyn.
Yeah.
They want the Marilyn. Oh, it might not quite be the right colour at the right time, but sometimes it doesn't matter. It's not like they've got pick of the bunch and I can show you 20 all at once, all in different colourways and different conditions. So often it's just opportunistic moments that define the price too.
So let's talk about Marilyn sets. We have sets with matching numbers. We have sets that have been curated. Tell me about the differences and how often you see matching number sets and curated sets.
So I think matching number sets really speak to a certain type of collector. It's someone who sees the value not only in the image or the individual artwork, but someone who sees the value in an entire series and holds that value together as one object. And that's very distinct from a collector or potentially a dealer or a gallerist who bought a set early on and then split it up to sell them individually. And I do think...
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Were these sold then originally as matching numbered sets?
Yeah. Which is why when now and again, I would say it's very rare you have a collector who's acquiring Marilyns to get a full set, but not the matching numbers.
Does that mean that every time you see a set that's a matching number, it was bought originally? Or are there collectors that try and pull them back together again?
It's so hard.
I think it's a really big challenge to try and get all those numbers. And also there's no guarantee that
They still exist.
They still exist, exactly.
Which is why they come with a premium. Like for someone to have purchased the whole set, kept it together, sold it together, and really looked after it in good condition, all of those factors together is what gives sets the premium over individuals.
And again, it's a perception thing. I think today people can really see the value in sets. But when you bought a set in 1970, for example, you might have gone, oh, I've got this great Andy Warhol set. And
they're large.
They weren't, they didn't have that value then.
Like,
they take up a lot of wall space.
10 works that take up, you need a very large house.
Exactly.
Or a very large storage.
So you don't have collectors looking to create a set?
Let's say more generally, we've come across collectors who want a matching set more than saying, oh, I'm slowly going to buy one at a time.
Building a Marilyn set is not a trend.
Could be a
so
trend.
Far. That could absolutely change in the future.
I think it's a trend.
We've got it. I've had it a few times with other series. I've never had it with a Marilyn, but with like the endangered species.
Yes.
But again, it's normally because someone has started.
Or Cowboys and Indians, you see people wanting to build sets.
Yes, exactly. But again, it's normally that someone started with one, then bought another one.
Is that partly because the images are actually different? Whereas with Marilyns, it's just the colours.
Often that's the way. And I think exactly that. Sometimes people have bought one image, they buy another one, and suddenly they're like, do you know what? I could buy all of them and have a set.
And then you have a beautifully curated art collection just through one series of Andy Warhol prints. Yeah.
But I would say that the value of the set goes down if the numbers are different. So if you had a set with all matching numbers bar one, that actually does bring the value down because it's the collector wants the full set.
Because they've been together, they're all part of one artwork
Yeah,
in
the
that way.
history. I mean, history, provenance, things like that come into play.
So provenance. Let's talk about provenance. There've been a number of Marilyns that have come up in sort of very well-known collector sales. Is the Marilyn market, because of that, becoming increasingly provenance driven? And what types of provenance are now genuinely moving the needle? Is it, as you've talked about, that early dealer, I bought it back in the day, or I knew Warhol, it was gifted, or single owner sales, celebrity provenance? What moves the needle on a Marilyn print?
I think with provenance, it comes down to, while it won't increase the value hugely, like you say, it will move the needle slightly. Having a work that was purchased from the factory, was purchased from a celebrity who owned it. I think actually something that's really added value recently is the amount of times it's traded, the ownership level. Has it been in the same collection the whole time? Has it been sold 50 times in the last, all of those things play into it and affect the value.
So fresh to market, as in
Yeah.
never been sold before, like since it was sold in the 70s, is the most attractive.
It's a very attractive addition to
Yeah.
the work, I would say.
And I think on the opposite side of that, there are collectors who are inheriting these works and don't necessarily know where they were originally bought, and that can be problematic for potential buyers, not having that very, very clear line of where the artwork has been in its lifetime. And there are lots of conversations about that. If you inherited a Marilyn print from your parent, they've sadly passed away, you don't know the full story necessarily. Maybe you didn't even know they had it in their house or in their collection. And that can sometimes be trickier to navigate when you're having conversations with buyers about provenance.
Yeah, because it comes back to this idea of trust, and like, they're expensive works. You want to know that the work you are getting is real and has the right provenance and everything, so that in the future, even if you don't have any intention of selling it, it has kind of that, don't know what
Yeah.
I'm looking for is, but
I think there can be a distinction sometimes when you see these incredible collections come to the market, and work selling incredibly well. It's always going to have that story into the provenance of this was in so and so's collection, versus a work that was bought by an incredibly reputable dealer from the artist directly, and you then bought from them. It doesn't have as interesting of a story necessarily, but it's got that security of its lineage. So I think there are different factors, and it's quite difficult to pinpoint and say which is the most attractive.
The growth trajectory of those complete sets is quite extraordinary over the past 10 years. We went from £700,000 to 2.4 million in recent years for a Marilyn set. Are you finding print collectors are slightly priced out of the market for these works? And are they being bought by canvas collectors? Or are you finding there is still a kind of appetite to reach for those sets?
I think that's a really interesting point. I think we talk about this quite a lot recently, which is that initially a lot of the collectors that came in is because the prints market is accessible. It's a starting point. It's not where the originals market is, and it's a really nice place to begin your collection. But sets fall into this middle ground between prints and originals. And so I think what we're seeing is quite a lot of the buyers of the sets are people who also play in the originals market, because they have to be because of the price point, which brings slightly different clientele, but all they're prints collectors who've worked their way up until they feel that they can acquire a set. Because I think to know about Warhol's print market is it's not a specialist thing, but you have to understand it a bit more. You have to understand what a print is.
Yeah.
Question we get asked every day.
I think it's got that element of kind of being like the mature collector who either has been buying prints or engages in the originals market. I think Jess and I rarely see someone who's never bought an artwork ever and says, "Find me a set of Warhol
Yes,
as my
yeah.
first purchase."
It's quite a mature
So I think
purchase.
that's
Yeah.
that's the major difference, yeah. But you do get incredibly serious print collectors who are really dedicated to the medium and the technique, who seek them out, who do think that, they see that value, and while they could buy just their 3 favorite colors, they understand that having the full set really is a significant
Mm.
addition to their collection.
Yeah.
And so we do see that kind of like variety within personal taste as well.
Yeah.
Yeah,
As-
and when we were saying before about building a collection,
Mm.
you start with 1, you have 2, you have 3. Sometimes somebody who has 3 will be like, I'll trade in those 3, I'll put those back on the market and I will now get the full set. And it's kind of like this progression, this story that they've gone through.
Yes, yes, it's definitely a
Right.
sort of final level, isn't it?
Yeah.
Now I'm ready for that commitment.
Mm.
So let's talk a little bit about geography and demographics of this Marilyn collector. Louisa, you work with consigners, and in your experience, which geography at the moment is sort of driving the supply? Is it, as we might all assume, the US with collectors who bought these back in the 70s and 80s? How much is actually moving through London and also Asia? I mean, that's shifted a lot since 2020, hasn't it?
I would say, there is from my experience, more supply in the US, purely because that's where the artist was based and people were living in New York at the time, picking things up at an accessible price point, in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, who a lot of these collectors now are mature, older, and deciding what they want to do as they go into retirement. So there is that element. But then on the demand side, it's quite a shift. And I think Jess is probably a better place to talk about demand for the works.
Yeah, I think there is a shift. I mean, it will always be New York. It will always be the US where there's such a drive because of the story around Warhol and everything that's known. But we see a huge amount of demand in London. Asia's becoming bigger and bigger in terms of demand. It's amazingly spread out now. It's not so centered into one place. And people, we've said this loads, but people who are building collections want a Warhol. And if they want a Warhol, they want one of the iconic pieces.
And so a lot of the consigners are, as you say, at sort of more boomer generation. What about buyers? Do buyers still resonate with Marilyn, the icon, in the same way that they did 20 years ago?
Someone was asking me this the other day, this generational shift and what it actually means. I think they do. And like we said, the Marilyn is so iconic and has become a kind of iconic figure to all generations now, that the value and the demand is still there. And also things that resonate with younger collectors, things that had resonated with their parents' generation, therefore resonate with them in a kind of familiarity way as well. So it doesn't feel like that is affecting the market too much at the moment.
Yeah, it's an interesting idea about the Marilyn image, because our younger collectors now might never have seen a Marilyn film, for example, right? They might never have seen her singing and dancing and performing, but they walk into a room and they recognize something as a Warhol and a Marilyn, and that I don't think is ever going to disappear. And I think that happens with all subject matter throughout history. And again, what you're going to have is you're going to have contemporary artists picking up and working on artists in the past. So we've seen Banksy do his Kate Moss as an iteration of Warhol's Marilyn. And that kind of dialogue that happens through art history as things develop and as the world changes will continue to happen. So people will constantly be looking back. I mean, we always look back and we look at Botticelli's Venus in the Shell. Andy Warhol did a version of that. So there is this dialogue that continues throughout art history, and I think that's really going to just keep the Marilyn Warhol image alive.
And lastly, what's your favourite colourway?
Well, I've already said mine's the teal number 23, haven't I, Jess?
For me, nothing to do with price. It's the pink 31.
Pink 31 for the win.
Love it.
Thank you guys so much. It's been a brilliant conversation.
Thank you.
for having us.
Great.